All right, let's try and unpack this. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this really jarring contrast. You've got a billionaire buying a what, $500 million super yacht. It's got a helipad, even a submarine,
Wow.
right? Now, same day, somewhere else, a child dies. Malnutrition. Because her family just couldn't afford, basic food.
It's a stark image. Almost unbelievable.
It is. But here's the really uncomfortable thing. This isn't like a one-off. It's kind of defining where we are right now. The gap between the super, super wealthy and the world's poorest people, well, it's never been wider. Literally.
And those Oxfam findings you mentioned,
Hmm.
they really underscore that. Billionaire wealth jumped by, was it $2 trillion in 2024?
2 trillion, yeah. And at the same time, extreme poverty is just stuck, stubbornly high.
And that reality, that stark contrast, it immediately throws up the core question, doesn't it? The one we're really digging into today. In a world where millions are still trapped in mass poverty, should billionaires even exist? Is that okay?
That question really hits you. Makes you confront some fundamental beliefs, Because on one side, you hear these powerful arguments. Billionaires are crucial. They drive innovation, create tons of jobs. They're huge philanthropists. They push progress.
The engines of the economy, some would say.
Exactly. But then the critics fire back. They say, hold on, this level of wealth concentration, that's not success.
No.
That's a sign the system's broken. It's a symptom of maybe systemic failure, and some argue a kind of moral neglect.
And that's exactly the territory we're navigating in this deep dive. Our mission really is to look at both sides of this incredibly complicated debate. We'll be drawing on philosophy, economic data, some really powerful real-world examples.
Yeah, trying to help you, the listener, sort of cut through the noise, grasp the core arguments on each side, see what really stands out, and ultimately ask that question. Do we need systemic changes to square prosperity with justice?
So where should we start? Maybe with the moral case against billionaires. That seems pretty central.
Yeah, let's dive right in there, because when you look at the sheer numbers, I mean, they're just staggering. Our sources are telling us the top 1% globally holds nearly half, like 45% of all wealth. Just let that sink in.
45%.
Meanwhile, the entire bottom half of the world's population, they share less than 10%. It's this vast, almost unimaginable imbalance.
Right. And that imbalance isn't just, a number on a page. That Credit Suisse report, the 2024 Global Wealth Report, it found that just 2,800 billionaires control more wealth than half the world's population put together.
2,800 people.
Yeah. And the argument that follows is, look, this can't be just the outcome of a healthy merit-based system. Critics say it's a clear sign of a system that has fundamentally failed to distribute resources in any kind of fair way.
And you have major economists really hammering this point about systemic failure. People like Thomas Piketty, the French economist famous for his work on wealth inequality.
Capital in the 21st century.
Right. Or Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate, who's often critical of global economic structures. They argue that when wealth gets this concentrated, it doesn't just sit there, it actively distorts democracy.
How so?
Well, it can influence politics, obviously,
Yeah.
but it also weakens social bonds, that sense of community cohesion, and it can even lead to political instability.
So their view is that this huge wealth isn't just like a fair reward for being productive or innovative.
Not solely, no. They see it often as a symptom of other things, like tax loopholes the average person can't use,
Right.
or massive inheritances, or even regulatory capture.
Yeah.
Where powerful players basically write the rules in their favor.
Okay, so the rules themselves are skewed, and this isn't just theoretical, is it? There are real-world consequences.
Definitely not just theoretical. The World Economic Forum research really highlights this. High inequality correlates directly with things like lower life expectancy, higher crime rates, less social mobility, meaning it's harder for people to improve their situation.
Wow. So the existence of billionaires, or maybe the system allowing that level of wealth, it has these tangible negative ripple effects across society.
Exactly. Which brings us back to that gut-wrenching contrast. All this wealth, alongside extreme poverty, global wealth is surging, yet you still have over 700 million people living on less than $2.15 a day.
Less than a cup of coffee in many places.
Right. And the UN figures 2 billion people without safe drinking water, 9 million dying each year from hunger-related causes. It's hard to fathom.
It is, and this is where the ethical challenge really bites, isn't it? Because when you look at the economics of it, these problems, well, honestly,
They seem solvable.
Solvable how?
Well, economists estimate that ending extreme global poverty might cost somewhere between, say, $175 billion and $265 billion a year.
Which sounds like a lot, but
But compared to current billionaire wealth, it's actually, well, it's less than 2% of their total holdings.
less than 2%. Think about it. If the world's 2,800 billionaires chipped in just 5% of their net worth each year, that could potentially fund universal access to clean water, basic nutrition, essential health care for everyone.
That puts it in perspective.
It does.
Huh.
And for many people, the fact that these resources exist untapped while millions suffer, they see that as a profound moral scandal.
Okay, so the numbers paint a stark picture, but what about philosophy? Do thinkers offer ways to grapple with these huge disparities ethically?
Oh, absolutely. This gets right to the heart of it. You have philosophers like John Rawls, for example. His big work, A Theory of Justice, really challenges us. He argued that inequalities are only justified if they work to benefit the least well-off in society, the most vulnerable.
Not just making the rich richer.
Precisely. It has to lift everyone up, especially those at the bottom. Then there's Peter Singer, a major voice in effective altruism. He argues quite powerfully that if you have surplus wealth more than you need for a comfortable life, failing to use it to alleviate extreme suffering is basically morally indefensible.
Strong words.
Very. These aren't small claims. They demand serious consideration.
And how do people around the world feel about this? Is there a general consensus, or does it vary a lot?
It definitely varies. Pew Research surveys show some interesting patterns. In countries with generally lower inequality, like, say, Sweden or Norway, people are much more likely to see extreme wealth as, well, immoral, or at least incompatible with social solidarity.
Okay.
But then you look at the United States, and attitudes are more ambivalent, mixed.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, it likely reflects that stronger cultural emphasis on individual achievement, the self-made narrative, the American dream idea. There's less consensus that extreme wealth itself is inherently problematic.
Right. But that brings us neatly to the other side of the coin, doesn't it? The defense of billionaires. Because for many people, billionaires aren't the issue at all. They're actually the solution, or at least a key part of progress. How does that argument go?
Well, the core defense usually revolves around innovation and risk-taking. The argument is that many billionaires are, visionaries. They take huge risks that others won't. Companies, governments might shy away.
Like who? Can you give some examples?
Sure. Think Elon Musk. Love him or hate him, SpaceX dramatically cut space launch costs. Tesla pushed electric vehicles into the mainstream.
Okay.
Or Oprah Winfrey broke barriers in media, yes, but also channeled her influence into massive philanthropic work. Jeff Bezos obviously transformed global commerce with Amazon.
So the idea is this potential for immense wealth is a carrot that drives these huge leaps forward.
Exactly, that's the narrative. And people point to Bill Gates, too. His foundation's investments in vaccines, global health, they've undeniably accelerated progress in critical areas.
Areas where maybe pure market forces wouldn't have been enough incentive.
Right. It often ties back into that American dream idea. The possibility of getting incredibly rich is seen as this powerful engine for innovation, for hard work, for that entrepreneurial spirit that proponents argue ultimately benefits society as a whole.
Okay, innovation is one thing. What about the more sort of day-to-day economic impact? Jobs, growth?
That's another major pillar of the defense. Billionaires, they argue, create enormous value by building companies. These companies generate millions of jobs, directly, indirectly, and expand the overall economy. Amazon's a classic example, employs over 1.5 million people globally.
And supports lots of smaller businesses in its supply chain too, right?
Exactly. Or think about Shenzhen in China. Sources point to tech billionaires playing a key role in turning it from basically a fishing village into this global tech powerhouse.
But is all billionaire wealth linked to that kind of value creation?
That's the nuance, and critics jump on this. Not all of it is. Some wealth is inherited, passed down through generations. Other fortunes might be built through monopolistic practices or financial speculation, which arguably don't create the same kind of broad societal value. That distinction is important.
And then there's philanthropy. This gets brought up a lot. The Giving Pledge, for instance. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, encouraging other billionaires to give away at least half their wealth. Sounds impressive, over 240 signees. Billions pledged.
It does sound impressive on the surface.
Yeah.
Hundreds of billions promised to good causes.
But is it always straightforward? I sometimes wonder if it's partly about image or maybe even dodging taxes. Is it genuine giving or strategic generosity?
That's a really critical question, and it leads straight into the critiques of billionaire philanthropy. Thinkers like Anand Giridharadas, his book Winners Take All, tackles this head on. He argues that this kind of private philanthropy, however well-intentioned it might seem, it's no substitute for fair taxes and real democratic accountability.
Meaning?
Meaning large-scale giving can actually end up reinforcing the power of the ultra-rich. It allows them to decide which problems get solved, how they get solved, essentially shaping public priorities without public oversight.
So they get to choose the agenda.
Right. And Judy Theradas argues it can sometimes distract from the systemic problems, maybe the very systems that allowed them to accumulate that wealth in the first place. It's like the arsonist sponsoring the fire department.
That's a powerful analogy. Okay, so we've heard these strong arguments for and against, but maybe the focus on individuals is misplaced. What if, as you hinted earlier, the real issue isn't the billionaires themselves, but the system, the rules of the game?
That's exactly where a lot of experts pivot the conversation. It's a crucial shift. Look at tax avoidance. That 2023 ProPublica investigation was eye-opening. It showed many U.S. billionaires pay effective tax rates way lower than average workers.
How?
Through things like capital gains loopholes, taxing investment profits less than wages, and complex offshore structures. Globally, we're talking trillions lost to tax avoidance every year. Yeah. So the insight here is if you just blame individuals, you miss the bigger picture. Unless you change the underlying system, implement genuinely progressive taxes, strengthen workers' rights, regulate corporations more effectively, this kind of extreme inequality is likely to just keep happening, no matter how generous some individuals are.
So if the system needs fixing, what are the actual proposals? What are these progressive alternatives people talk about?
Well, there's some pretty bold ideas gaining traction. Economists like Gabriel Zucman and Emmanuel Saez are big proponents of a global wealth tax.
A tax on their total net worth, not just income.
Exactly. Taxing the ultra-rich on their accumulated wealth each year? Their research suggests even a modest tax, say 1 or 2% on the biggest fortunes, could raise hundreds of billions annually.
And that money could be used for
Universal health care, quality education, seriously tackling poverty, climate action, you name it. Another big idea is universal basic income, UBI.
Right, Andrew Yang talked about that a lot. Rutger Bregman, too.
Yeah. The idea is simple. Give every citizen a regular, unconditional income floor. Proponents argue it could drastically cut poverty, simplify complicated welfare systems, and give people more security, especially with automation threatening jobs.
How would you fund that?
Again, taxing extreme wealth is often proposed. Also taxing carbon, or maybe the profits from automation itself. Then there are ideas around corporate profit sharing.
Making companies share the wealth with their workers?
Basically, yeah. Requiring large companies to distribute a certain percentage of profits to employees, not just executives and shareholders. Yeah. Spreading the gains more broadly.
These aren't just tweaks, are they? These sound like fundamentally reimagining how capitalism works.
They really are. And that leads to broader discussions about different economic models entirely. You hear about stakeholder capitalism. The World Economic Forum pushes this idea. It says companies shouldn't just focus on shareholder value.
They need to consider
their workers, their customers, the communities they operate in, the environment.
Okay.
A broader set of responsibilities.
Yeah.
Then there's democratic socialism. Advocating for a mixed economy, strong social safety nets, maybe public ownership of essential services like energy or healthcare, alongside private enterprise, but all within strong democratic control.
To ensure the economy serves people, not the other way around.
That's the goal. And then there's Kate Raworth's donut economics, which is fascinating.
The donut?
Yeah, picture a donut. The hole in the middle is where people lack essentials, food, water, healthcare. We want everyone out of the hole, meeting basic social foundations. That's the inner ring. The outer ring represents Earth's ecological limits, climate change, biodiversity loss. We can't overshoot those.
So the donut itself is the sweet spot, the safe and just space for humanity.
Exactly. Balancing human needs or planetary boundaries. It fundamentally shifts the goal away from just endless GDP growth towards thriving within limits.
So the big underlying question is, can our current form of capitalism be reformed enough? Or do we need something more transformative?
That's the debate, really. A huge ongoing debate.
Let's bring this down to earth a bit. How do these different approaches actually play out in different countries? Do you see examples of these models working?
We definitely see variations. The Scandinavian or Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, are often cited. They generally combine high taxes and strong welfare states with dynamic free market economies.
Then the result.
Usually low poverty, low inequality, yet they still foster innovation and entrepreneurship. It suggests a balance is possible, though obviously their context is specific.
How does that compare to, say, the US?
Well, the U.S. model is quite different. Lower taxes overall, less redistribution through welfare programs, and you see the outcome. More billionaires, yes, but also significantly higher rates of poverty and inequality compared to those Nordic countries.
And in developing nations.
There, the picture is often different again. Weak institutions, maybe limited tax collection, less redistribution. Wealth often gets highly concentrated among a small elite, sometimes linked to political connections with less trickle down to the general population.
It really highlights how much the rules of the game and institutions matter.
Absolutely critical. And perhaps nothing threw these global disparities and the systems behind them into sharper relief than the recent COVID-19 pandemic.
How so? What did the pandemic reveal?
It was like a stress test for the global economy, and the results were, well, disturbing.
Yeah.
Between 2020 and 2024, billionaire wealth absolutely rocketed up by over 50% globally.
While at the same time,
Hundreds of millions lost jobs, fell into poverty, faced hunger. The contrast was just brutal.
and did it expose anything about how wealth grows?
It did. Sources noted that in countries with weaker governance, it was often billionaire heirs whose fortunes grew fastest. That points towards the role of inheritance and maybe lacks regulation, not just pure innovation.
So it raises questions about the resilience of our systems, doesn't it? If shocks like a pandemic concentrate wealth even further.
Exactly. Can our systems handle future crises, climate change, other pandemics if wealth and power remain so intensely concentrated? It's a serious question.
And the stimulus packages in response to COVID.
That also deepened the divide. In wealthy countries, huge stimulus often flowed into asset markets, boosting the wealth of those who already own stocks and property.
While poorer countries.
Struggled to afford even basic relief measures. They lacked the fiscal space. This massively widened the global gap and led to renewed, urgent calls for international cooperation on things like tax reform and development aid.
So pulling all these threads together as we wrap up this deep dive, it's crystal clear that this question, should billionaires exist alongside mass poverty?
Yeah.
It's not simple. It's not just about feeling envious or admiring success. It's really about what kind of society we want to build collectively.
Right. And the reality we've explored is incredibly complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not all billionaires are the same. Their wealth comes from different sources. And not all criticisms are equally valid either.
But what seems to be the core insight, the thing that really stands out,
I think it comes back to the system versus the individual. The central issue might not be the mere existence of billionaires per se, but the underlying economic and political systems that allow, maybe even encourage, such extreme disparities to emerge and persist.
which means tackling that inequality requires more than just hoping for individual generosity.
Definitely. As important as philanthropy can be in specific cases, the scale of the problem suggests we need bolder structural changes. Things like genuinely progressive taxation, robust social safety nets that provide real security, and maybe even rethinking the basic assumptions of capitalism itself.
Okay. So to leave our listeners with something to really chew on, a final thought.
How about this? Maybe the true measure of our economic and moral success isn't how many billionaires we create. Maybe the real test is how well we care for the least fortunate among us.
How we ensure that human ingenuity, innovation, and prosperity actually benefit everyone, not just a select few at the very, very top.
Exactly. How do we harness all that potential for the good of all? That seems like the fundamental challenge.